May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. In today's reading from the Gospel of Matthew, we see that the disciples have a problem. In fact, they have several problems. They lived in a community that suffered from income inequality, racism, domestic violence, political corruption, military aggression, food insecurity, rampant unemployment, and incurable disease. When Jesus first called them, they put down their nets and followed him because they believed that he could bring hope and healing to a very troubled world. They soon learned three important lessons. First, that Jesus really could bring hope and healing to people who desperately longed for these things. Second, that Jesus expected them to help him do this work. And third, that this work is very hard. As Matthew tells this famous story, one day, after a long circuit of teaching and healing, and just after hearing that King Herod had executed his cousin John the Baptist, Jesus decided to withdraw in a boat to a deserted place by himself. And who could blame him? But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. Despite his own feelings of exhaustion and grief, and knowing full well that he would eventually need to get some rest, he chose in that moment to meet the needs of the people who came to him. Then, as night was falling, his disciples decide that Jesus has done enough for one day. They encourage him to send the crowds away to the neighboring villages to buy food for themselves. Although they tried to make it sound like their idea is in the best interest of the hungry crowds, they were mostly thinking about their own needs. Like Jesus, they were tired and hungry, and worried and grieving, if not directly for the death of John, certainly for Jesus' sake. It was time to send the crowds away and get some rest. If I were one of these disciples, I'm sure that I would be shocked and dismayed by Jesus' response. They need not go away. You give them something to eat. The disciples ask how they are supposed to do this without the resources they would need to do the job properly. Each of them was probably thinking, that's crazy. How are we supposed to give all these people something to eat, seeing that we only have 5 loaves and 2 fish? Barely enough to feed ourselves, let alone this enormous crowd. And why should we do this anyway? Why can't these people leave us alone and take care of their problems themselves? In any case, Jesus doesn't pay much attention to their concern. He tells them to give him the bread and fish. Then he blesses them, breaks them, and asks the disciples to divide them up among the crowds. And all ate and were filled, and they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. It's true that Jesus did an amazing thing here, feeding several thousand people with a little bit of bread and fish. It's also likely that the disciples were even more tired and frustrated at the end of this miraculous meal than they were before it started. They were the ones who had to distribute the food and clean up afterwards. They were the ones who had to face the demanding crowds without really knowing what to do or how to do it. And according to Matthew, they carried with them the lingering fear that they would be put in a similar or worse position again. Following Jesus would mean giving up any kind of normal standards for what is appropriate, reasonable, or safe. Jesus would push them far beyond what they thought they could do or even wanted to do. Jesus would ask them again and again to place the needs of others ahead of their own and to work beyond the point of exhaustion before they could rest. That's the bad news of discipleship. The work of feeding God's people is never ending. It requires the efforts of a lot of people to accomplish it, and it is very hard. But there is good news too. Matthew makes it clear that Jesus is very much in charge of the work of feeding the crowd. He He doesn't just make an impossible demand and then force the disciples to figure out how to accomplish the task by themselves. Also, Jesus has a way of turning a tiny offering of 5 loaves and 2 fish into an enormous feast. In financial terms, the disciples got an amazing return on their investment. 12 baskets of food left over, even after thousands had finished eating. Once the disciples got past their resentment, shock, and frustration, and just did what Jesus told them to do, they far exceeded even the most optimistic assessment of what they thought they could accomplish when Jesus said, "You give them something to eat." Matthew's message to us, Jesus' present-day disciples, is that we too can succeed in the work of feeding and healing God's hungry people if we are willing to give Jesus what we have and trust him to multiply it. This confidence in Jesus' power to amplify what we offer generates hope both for the disciples and for the people they serve on Jesus' behalf. The hungry are fed, and Jesus renews the hope in his companions that drew them to him in the first place. I don't know about you, but I find this message of hope reassuring in this enormously difficult time. Like Jesus' first disciples, we see our community suffering from income inequality, racism, domestic violence, political corruption, military aggression, food insecurity, rampant unemployment, and incurable disease. We look to Jesus as the one who can bring hope and healing to this very troubled world. We know that Jesus is calling us to give God's people something to eat, both literally and metaphorically. Jesus is calling us to attend to the needs of the hungry and sick, even when we are afraid of being hungry and sick ourselves. Jesus is calling us to confront injustice, even when the simple act of going outside to stand with other disciples is extremely risky. Jesus is calling us to be beacons of hope and reconciliation, even when our traditional ways of doing this work are inaccessible. We are being asked to sacrifice our greatest source of strength, gathering in Eucharistic community, to ensure the safety of God's most vulnerable people. We are tired, afraid, grieving, and unsure of how much longer we can keep things going without any rest in sight. We are tempted, like all disciples in this kind of situation, to say to Jesus, "Send these people away to attend to their own needs and give us a break." We feel like Jesus' disciples when he told them to feed a crowd of thousands with 5,000 loaves of bread and 2 fish. As we stumble around, trying to figure out how to do God's work in these extraordinary circumstances, and without knowing if any of our efforts will bear any fruit, Jesus is taking our meager offerings and blessing them and multiplying them so that we can feed God's hungry people in creative new ways. We are learning how to pray together, encourage each other, and share each other's burdens without being physically present to each other in a building. We are following Jesus' example of sacrificial love when we practice all those irritating social distancing protocols, not to protect ourselves, but to make sure that others are safe. We feed God's people when we give as generously as we can to organizations that confront injustice, advocate for the voiceless, and offer direct care to people who are hungry and sick. We spread God's good news when we call a lonely neighbor, support an anxious friend, treat strangers with kindness and respect behind our masks, or any other way that we break down barriers that keep God's people apart. These small offerings, multiplied by Jesus' blessing, have an effect far beyond what we can see and verify in the moment. For over 2,000 years, people like us have been dropping our nets to follow Jesus into the most heartrending places of need and despair to share his work of healing, feeding, and reconciliation. These disciples have felt overwhelmed by the enormity of the task, and they have complained that Jesus was asking too much of them. Yet they have always found Jesus right there with them to direct and multiply and bless whatever they are willing to give to accomplish more than they could ever hope to do alone. I pray that in these present-day challenges we will remember how tired and grieving Jesus, with the help of a few weary disciples like us, fed 5,000 men besides women and children. May this miracle inspire us to do our own part to advance Jesus' mission as he calls us to do today and every day. Amen.